Hello friends, we are here today in Luke chapter 7. Now there's 4 sections in this chapter, and I'm going to try and briefly mention the first 3 and talk about the fourth. 2 of these sections we've talked about in length before, and 2 of them are kind of new to the book of Luke. So we're going to talk about the one at the end, but there's one in the middle, and there's not much that needs to be said about it because it's just kind of a straightforward miracle. So here we go. So what happens first is a centurion comes to Jesus, or actually the centurion doesn't come. Some people representing the centurion come up to Jesus and say the centurion has a servant that's very valuable to him, and he wants you to heal him. And he says, I'm not worthy for you to come over to my house, which is an interesting thing for a centurion to say. But I'm a guy of authority. And when I ask people to do things under my authority, they always do it. And this guy is recognizing that Jesus has authority over life and death, over wellness and creation. So he's basically declaring that he knows that Jesus is God. And it says something here I think is really interesting that they don't mention in the other 2 gospels that we've read so far. And that is that this centurion seemed like a really good guy. He built the synagogue. And I don't know exactly which area he was living in, but he built a synagogue for the Jewish people. And he's a Roman, he's a Gentile. But it sounds like he was a pretty amazing guy. And Jesus says, nowhere even in Israel have I seen faith like this. A clear example of some amazing faith. So that's a great story. I talked a lot about it when we went through Mark and when we went through Matthew, but I love that story. But next, there was a woman. She was a widow and she had one son, and this person was dead. And they were carrying him. There was they had the pallbearers. They were starting to carry him out. And Jesus had compassion on the woman because this was their only son. And he goes over and he touches the casket or whatever, and the person wakes up and starts talking. So not much that needs to be said except for what an amazing miracle. The next thing that happens is, I think the reason that they mention that is that they hear about what Jesus is doing, especially about this man that Jesus raised from the dead. And so the disciples of John send a message to Jesus saying, are you the one who is to come, or should we wait for another? And Jesus is saying, tell John what you've seen. You've seen all of the things that the Messiah was supposed to do. If you look in the scriptures of what the Messiah will do, those are the things that I'm doing. However, John and many other people had this idea of what the Messiah was going to do. He was going to get the Romans off their backs, is what they thought. But Jesus had no intention of getting the Romans off their back. He had every intention of saving their souls and forgiving their sins and giving them a way to salvation. So he says after that, you guys are like children saying, we played funeral and you didn't cry, and we played wedding and you didn't sing. You're not playing our game the way that you want us to. And Jesus really didn't come to to play a game. He came for his own purpose, and that's what he's here for. Now, the last section is interesting, and it has a striking resemblance to another story that is mentioned in the other Gospels, but it is a separate story. So he's reclining at a table of someone, he's a guest at their house, and a woman comes in and anoints Jesus. Now, in the other Gospels, it mentions something in Bethany toward the end of his ministry and the end of his life, and she takes an alabaster jar of pure nard, puts it on his head. This is a different story, but it looks similar. This woman is a sinner, it says. The other woman, it says in John, is Mary Magdalene. This woman comes in, starts crying, wets his feet, cleans off his feet with her hair, and then takes a jar, an alabaster jar, just like in the other story, but it's not pure nard. It's oil. It's like a scented oil, and she puts it on his feet, not his head. Now, the criticism in the other one was that what she put on Jesus was very expensive. But the criticism in this one is that if Jesus knew who this woman was and who her character was, he wouldn't even allow her to touch him. And so Jesus, knowing the thoughts of this man and where his heart was and where her heart is, it must have been an interesting experience, for Jesus to know people's hearts and to see this man whose heart is probably very far away from God, and seeing this woman whose heart is right where it should be. And it must have seemed like a great injustice to know he was judging her when, maybe it should have been the other way around. And so he speaks to the man, I have a question for you. Let's say that there's two men, and one has a great debt and the other has a much lesser debt. And the ruler forgives both of their debts. Who is going to have more gratitude? And rightly he said, the one that had a greater debt. And Jesus looks down at the woman and says, your sins are forgiven. And he says, look, I came into your house and you didn't wash my feet, which was a common thing. When you would come in, you would have a servant come in and wash the feet of your guests. And he's like, look, when I came in, nobody washed my feet, but she did with her tears. And you didn't give me any water, but she had tears. You didn't anoint my head with oil, but she has given me this, this expensive oil with perfume in it. And a couple days ago, I had mentioned the Pharisees. And I said, when you think of a Pharisee, don't think of, someone who's a rotten person that you probably wouldn't like. Think of someone like me. Think of a normal Christian. I grew up, not doing drugs or swearing or sleeping around. I wasn't what I would consider to be a sinner. A sinner is not how people would define me. However, I'm a sinner just like anybody else is. And just because I think of myself in this way that I don't identify with those people doesn't mean that the penalty for my debt would be any different from the penalty of anybody else's debt. If in the parable that Jesus was writing, or that he was talking about, the penalty would have been the same. They would have had to go to debtor's prison. One person would have had more and one person would have had less, but we think that there's some sort of advantage to living a Christian life when you started off as someone who was, quote unquote good. But it's not advantage, it's not a disadvantage either. It's just different. However, the heart of someone who has come a longer way is going to be much greater. And in some ways that is an advantage. So there's a way around this. If you shouldn't be like, oh well, maybe I should have sinned more before I came to Christ, or maybe I should sin more now. It doesn't work like that. The way that you can get around this is to realize that the wages of sin is death, and we are just as worthy of death as anybody else. We need to humble ourselves and maybe not consider the people that sin more than us, but we should look to God, someone who has never sinned at all. And so that is Luke chapter 7. All right, have a great day. Bye.